Behind the uniformed facades of Nazi Germany's most notorious leaders lay families torn apart by ideology, violence, and unspeakable acts. While history remembers the crimes of their fathers, the children of these war criminals faced fates that remained hidden for decades. Some were murdered by their own parents, others lived lives of torment, carrying names that would forever mark them as descendants of evil. Tonight, we uncover the darkest family secrets of the Third Reich's inner circle. What happened to the innocent children caught in the crossfire of their father's twisted ambitions? The answers will shock you. Josef Goebbels, Hitler's master of propaganda, had 6 children with his wife Magda: Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holda, Hedda, and Haida. Their names carefully chosen to begin with the letter H, honoring their beloved Führer. These children lived privileged lives in the heart of Nazi Germany, completely unaware that their father was orchestrating some of history's most heinous propaganda campaigns. As the war drew to its inevitable conclusion in April 1945, Josef and Magda Goebbels made a decision that would horrify the world. Rather than allow their children to live in a world without National Socialism, they chose to end their young lives in the most chilling manner imaginable. On May 1st, 1945, in Hitler's bunker beneath Berlin, Magda Goebbels administered crushed cyanide capsules to each of her 6 children, aged between 4 and 12 years old. The children, dressed in their finest nightgowns, believed they were receiving medicine to help them sleep through the terrifying sounds of artillery above. One by one, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Holda, Hedda, and Haida fell into an eternal slumber, victims of their parents' fanatical devotion to a dying regime. The method of their deaths was particularly disturbing. Medical examinations later revealed that several of the children had bite marks on their tongues, suggesting they had fought against the bitter taste of the poison. Helga, the eldest at 12, had bruising around her mouth and throat, indicating that force had been used to ensure she consumed the fatal dose. Witnesses later described finding the children's bodies arranged peacefully in their beds, as if they were simply sleeping. The youngest, Heidi, was just 4 years old. Her small hands were still clutching a doll that Magda had given her moments before administering the poison, telling her it would help her have sweet dreams. The psychological preparation for this act had been months in the making. Magda Goebbels had been conditioning the children throughout the final months of the war, telling them stories about how they were special, chosen children who would never have to live in an impure world. She described their future deaths as a sacred duty, a final service to the Führer who had given their lives meaning. Josef Goebbels had initially opposed the plan, not out of paternal love, but because he believed the children could be useful as propaganda tools even in defeat. It was only in the final days, when he realized that capture was inevitable, that he agreed to their murder. His diary entries from those last weeks reveal a chilling calculation about the children's fate, weighing their potential value as martyrs against the risk of them growing up to reject Nazi ideology. The Goebbels couple took their own lives shortly after, leaving behind a legacy of unimaginable family destruction. But their children's deaths were just the beginning of a pattern that would emerge across Nazi leadership: the willingness to destroy their own offspring, rather than allow them to live free from the ideology that had consumed their parents' lives. The bodies of the Goebbels children were discovered by Soviet troops 3 days later. The soldiers, hardened by years of brutal warfare, were reportedly moved to tears by the sight of the 6 small bodies arranged in their beds, innocent victims of their parents' fanatical beliefs. But while the Goebbels children's suffering ended in that bunker, other Nazi leaders' children would endure decades of psychological torment that would make death seem like mercy. Josef Mengele, the notorious Angel of Death, who conducted horrific medical experiments at Auschwitz, had one son, Rudolf Mengele, born in 1944. Rolf's story represents one of the most complex and disturbing cases of a Nazi child's post-war experience, involving decades of deception, psychological manipulation, and inherited trauma. For the first 15 years of his life, Rolf believed his father was dead. His mother, Irene Mengele, told him that Josef had died heroically in the war, and Rolf grew up thinking he was the son of a fallen German soldier. He was raised on stories of his father's supposed bravery and sacrifice, creating an idealized image of a man who was actually one of history's most sadistic criminals. The truth was that Josef Mengele was very much alive, hiding in South America, and secretly maintaining contact with his wife through coded letters. These letters, discovered decades later, reveal the depth of Mengele's continued obsession with his wartime experiments and his disturbing interest in his son's physical and intellectual development. In these secret communications, Mengele would ask detailed questions about Rolf's height, weight, eye color changes, and academic performance. He requested photographs showing Rolf's facial features from different angles and asked for samples of his handwriting to analyze for signs of inherited traits. Most chillingly, Mengele expressed interest in whether Rolf showed any signs of the scientific curiosity that had driven his own medical career. In 1959, when Rolf was 15 years old, his mother finally revealed the truth about his father's identity and whereabouts. The revelation shattered Rolf's understanding of his own identity and plunged him into a psychological crisis that would last for years. The heroic father figure he had constructed in his mind was replaced by the reality of a man whose name was synonymous with medical torture and child murder. What made Rolf's situation particularly traumatic was the nature of his father's crimes. While other Nazi children could rationalize their father's actions as wartime decisions or political mistakes, Rolf had to confront the fact that his father had tortured and murdered children, often children the same age as Rolf himself, when he learned the truth. The psychological documentation from Rolf's therapy sessions, which were made public decades later, reveals the depth of his trauma. He described recurring nightmares where he was strapped to a medical table while his father performed experiments on him. In other dreams, he saw himself as one of the child victims at Auschwitz, looking up at his father's face as he administered fatal injections. Rolf developed severe anxiety disorders and struggled with feelings of inherited guilt that were so intense he considered changing his name and moving to another country. He became obsessed with medical journals, trying to understand the scientific basis for his father's experiments, hoping to find some rational explanation that would make the crimes comprehensible. In 1977, Rolf made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He traveled to South America to confront his father face to face. The meeting, which took place in Brazil, was described by Rolf as the most psychologically devastating experience of his life. According to Rolf's later testimony to investigators, Josef Mengele showed no remorse for his actions. Instead, he spent hours justifying his experiments, claiming they had advanced medical science and expressing frustration that the world didn't appreciate his contributions. He spoke about his child victims with clinical detachment, referring to them by numbers rather than names, and describing their deaths as necessary sacrifices for scientific progress. Most disturbing of all, Mengele asked Rolf detailed questions about his own children, Rolf's children, expressing interest in their physical characteristics and development. He requested photographs and suggested that the family's genetic traits were worth studying. Rolf later described feeling like his father was evaluating his grandchildren as potential experimental subjects. During their conversations, Mengele showed Rolf journals he had kept during his time at Auschwitz, filled with detailed notes about his experiments and sketches of his victims. He spoke about specific children he had killed, describing their reactions to various procedures with the same tone he might use to discuss laboratory animals. Rolf left the meeting convinced that his father was not just unrepentant, but genuinely psychopathic. The realization that he shared DNA with someone capable of such evil sent Rolf into a severe depression that required hospitalization and intensive psychiatric treatment. When Josef Mengele died in 1979, Rolf faced another psychological crisis. Part of him felt relief that his father could no longer hurt anyone, but another part felt an unexpected grief for the father he had never really known. The conflicting emotions were so intense that Rolf required years of additional therapy to process them. Rolf's own children were eventually told about their grandfather's identity, creating a third generation affected by Josef Mengele's crimes. Rolf described the difficulty of explaining to his children that their grandfather was one of history's most notorious war criminals, and watching them struggle with the same questions about inherited guilt that had tormented him. The Mengele family trauma extends even further. Rolf's cousins, the children of Josef's brothers, also faced discrimination and psychological challenges due to their family name. Several changed their surnames and moved to different countries, but the burden of their family history followed them wherever they went. But even the psychological torment experienced by the Mengele family would pale in comparison to the systematic deception and identity theft that would consume another Nazi leader's children for over 7 decades. Heinrich Himmler, architect of the Holocaust and one of the most feared men in Nazi Germany, had 3 children: Gudrun, adopted son Gerhard, and daughter Nanette Dorothea. Their post-war fates would involve elaborate deceptions, stolen identities, and psychological manipulation that lasted for decades, creating one of the most complex cases of inherited Nazi trauma ever documented. Gudrun Himmler, born in 1929, was her father's favorite child. Himmler called her Puppy and took her on tours of concentration camps, presenting the facilities as work camps where enemies of the state were being reformed. The young girl had no understanding of the mass murder occurring around her, seeing only the sanitized version her father wanted her to see. These visits were more than just father-daughter outings. They were part of Himmler's systematic indoctrination of his beloved daughter. He would walk her through specially prepared sections of the camps, where prisoners had been forced to clean and organize areas to look like productive workshops. Gudrun was shown prisoners working on crafts and told they were learning valuable skills that would help them become productive citizens. What Gudrun didn't see were the gas chambers, the medical experimentation blocks, or the crematoriums. She was kept away from the areas where the true horror of the Holocaust was unfolding, while being fed a steady diet of propaganda about her father's humanitarian work in reforming criminal elements of society. When the war ended, Gudrun was 16 years old. Unlike other Nazi leaders' children who tried to escape their past, she did the opposite. She became one of the most vocal defenders of her father's legacy. For over 60 years, until her death in 2018, Gudrun worked tirelessly to rehabilitate Heinrich Himmler's image, claiming he was a loving father who had been misunderstood by history. But Gudrun's dedication went far beyond simple denial. She joined and helped fund organizations dedicated to helping former SS officers escape prosecution. She provided financial support to war criminals hiding in South America and worked to establish networks for Nazi fugitives. Her apartment became a meeting place for unrepentant Nazis, where they would share stories and plan ways to spread Holocaust denial propaganda. The psychological impact of this devotion was severe. Gudrun never married, never had children of her own, and spent her entire adult life consumed by the need to defend a man responsible for orchestrating the murder of millions. Mental health professionals who studied her case described it as one of the most extreme examples of denial and psychological compartmentalization ever documented. Gudrun's dedication to her father's memory became increasingly disturbing as details of her activities emerged. She maintained correspondence with dozens of Nazi war criminals, providing them with money, false documents, and emotional support. She organized secret meetings where former SS officers would share stories of their wartime service and express frustration about the world's failure to appreciate their sacrifices. Most chillingly, Gudrun kept detailed records of her activities, including photographs of her meetings with war criminals and copies of letters she had written defending Nazi ideology. These documents, discovered after her death, revealed the extent to which she had devoted her entire life to perpetuating the beliefs that had led to genocide. But perhaps even more disturbing was the fate of Himmler's adopted son, Gerhard. Born Gerhard von der Aa, he was adopted by the Himmlers in 1933 when he was just 11 years old. After the war, Gerhard completely disappeared from public records, becoming one of the most successful cases of identity erasure in post-war history. Researchers believe that Himmler's wife, Margaret, arranged for Gerhard to be secretly relocated and given a new identity to protect him from association with the family name. The operation was so thorough that it involved forged birth certificates, fabricated family histories, and the creation of entirely new personal documentation. For decades, investigators tried to trace what happened to Gerhard. Some reports suggested he was moved to South America. Others claimed he remained in Germany under an assumed name. The truth remained hidden until recently, when genealogical research revealed that Gerhard had indeed been living under a false identity for over 70 years. The discovery revealed that Gerhard had been working as a teacher in a small German town, living under a name that bore no resemblance to his original identity. He had married, had children, and lived an apparently normal life while carrying the secret of his connection to Heinrich Himmler. When confronted with evidence of his true identity, Gerhard suffered a complete psychological breakdown, requiring hospitalization and intensive psychiatric care. The psychological toll of living with a stolen identity for 7 decades was devastating. Gerhard described feeling like he had never truly existed as a real person, having spent his entire adult life playing a role created by others. He struggled with severe dissociation and identity confusion, unsure of which memories were real and which were part of his constructed persona. The third Himmler child, Nanette Dorothea, faced her own unique horror. Born in 1944, she was essentially abandoned by her mother after the war and raised by relatives who told her that her parents had died in an accident. She didn't discover her true parentage until she was in her 40s, when a genealogist researching Nazi families contacted her with documentation proving her identity. The revelation destroyed Nanette's mental health. She had spent her entire adult life believing she was the daughter of ordinary German citizens who died tragically young. Learning that her father was Heinrich Himmler sent her into a psychological spiral that required years of intensive therapy and medication. Nanette described the discovery as feeling like her entire life had been built on lies. Every memory of her childhood, every story about her parents, every assumption about her family history was suddenly revealed to be false. The psychological impact was so severe that she developed what psychiatrists diagnosed as dissociative identity disorder, struggling to reconcile her constructed identity with the horrifying reality of her true parentage. While the Himmler family's web of deception and denial created decades of psychological torment, another Nazi leader's children would face a different kind of horror, one that involved confronting their father's monumental legacy, literally carved in stone across an entire nation. Albert Speer, Hitler's chief architect and later Minister of Armaments, had 6 children who would face the unique burden of seeing their father's work towering over German cities for decades after the war. Albert Jr., Hilda, Fritz, Margaret, Arnold, and Ernst grew up in the shadow of both their father's crimes and his massive architectural legacy that served as permanent monuments to Nazi ideology. Albert Speer Jr., born in 1934, became an architect like his father, but spent his entire career trying to atone for his family name. Unlike other Nazi children who tried to hide their identity, Albert Jr. chose a different path. He became obsessed with designing buildings that promoted peace, democracy, and human rights, creating what he called architectural penance for his father's sins. The psychological burden was crushing. Every major German city contained buildings, monuments, or infrastructure projects designed by his father. Albert Jr. described walking through Berlin as a constant reminder of his family's connection to Nazi ideology. The Olympic Stadium, sections of the Chancellery that survived the war, roads, bridges, and numerous other structures served as permanent monuments to his father's collaboration with Hitler. What made Albert Jr.'s situation particularly torturous was his father's post-war behavior. Unlike other Nazi leaders who remained defiant or went into hiding, Albert Speer Sr. became famous for his supposed remorse and cooperation with Allied authorities. He wrote best-selling memoirs, gave countless interviews, and presented himself as the good Nazi who had simply been caught up in events beyond his control. This created a complex dynamic for Albert Jr., who knew from family conversations that his father's public remorse was largely performative. Privately, Speer Sr. continued to express admiration for Hitler's vision and showed little genuine understanding of the moral implications of his actions. He would speak fondly of his architectural plans for rebuilding Berlin as the capital of a 1,000-year Reich, describing the projects with the same enthusiasm he had shown during the war. Albert Jr. spent years in therapy trying to reconcile the public image of his repentant father with the private reality of a man who remained fundamentally unchanged by his experiences. He described family dinners where his father would sketch new building designs on napkins, explaining how they could be modified versions of his Nazi-era plans, seemingly oblivious to the psychological impact this had on his children. The situation became even more complicated when Albert Jr. began receiving commissions for major architectural projects in the 1970s and 1980s. Client meetings would often begin with uncomfortable discussions about his family name. Some potential clients would refuse to work with him entirely, viewing any association with the Speer name as morally unacceptable. Others would hire him specifically because of his name, hoping to generate publicity or controversy around their projects. Albert Jr. described the constant internal struggle between his love for architecture and his horror at how his father had used the same skills to serve evil. He spoke about standing in front of buildings his father designed and feeling physically ill, yet being unable to look away from the technical brilliance of the construction. He developed what he called architectural PTSD, experiencing panic attacks when walking through areas of Berlin that contained his father's work. The psychological impact extended to Albert Jr.'s own creative process. He found himself unable to design large-scale or monumental buildings, fearing that anything imposing would remind people of his father's work. His architectural style became deliberately modest and human-scaled, a conscious rejection of the grandiose vision that had characterized Nazi architecture. The other Speer children faced their own unique challenges. Fritz Speer became a sculptor, but refused to work on any large-scale projects, limiting himself to small, intimate pieces that could never be mistaken for monuments. He described feeling like any artistic ambition was tainted by his family name, and spent years creating deliberately forgettable works that he hoped would disappear from public memory. Hilde Speer moved to France and changed her name, but found that her father's international fame made escape impossible. French journalists would periodically track her down for interviews, forcing her to relive her family's history just when she thought she had found peace. She developed severe agoraphobia and spent most of her adult life as a recluse, afraid that any public appearance would result in confrontation about her father's crimes. Margaret Speer moved to England and attempted to build a new life, but was eventually tracked down by researchers studying Nazi families. The discovery that she was Albert Speer's daughter led to years of harassment and death threats. She described receiving letters from Holocaust survivors expressing their hatred for her family, and others from neo-Nazis trying to recruit her to their cause. Perhaps most tragically, Ernst Speer, the youngest son, developed severe mental health issues that family members directly attributed to the burden of his family name. He struggled with depression and anxiety throughout his adult life, and was never able to maintain stable employment or relationships. Ernst described feeling like he was trapped in a prison built by his father's legacy, unable to escape the shadow of buildings that would outlive them all. The psychological documentation from Ernst's treatment reveals the extent of his trauma. He developed an obsessive fear of construction sites, and would take elaborate detours to avoid seeing new buildings under construction. He described nightmares where he was trapped inside massive concrete structures that were slowly closing in on him, unable to find an exit, while his father's voice echoed through the corridors, explaining architectural principles. Arnold Speer, another of Albert's sons, took a different approach to dealing with his family legacy. He became obsessed with documenting his father's crimes, spending years researching the use of slave labor in Nazi construction projects. This research revealed that Albert Speer Sr. had been directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of forced laborers, contradicting his post-war claims of ignorance about the human cost of his projects. Arnold's research created additional family trauma, as it provided concrete evidence that their father's expressions of remorse were fraudulent. The discovery that Albert Speer Sr. had personally signed orders for the brutal treatment of slave laborers sent Arnold into a psychological crisis that required hospitalization. But while the Speer children struggled with their father's monumental legacy carved in stone, other Nazi leaders' children would face an even more complex psychological burden: the weight of bureaucratic evil that had organized genocide with administrative precision. Adolf Eichmann, the bureaucrat who organized the logistics of the Holocaust, had 4 sons: Klaus, Horst, Dieter, and Ricardo. Their post-war experience would prove that even children who barely remembered their father could be psychologically destroyed by his legacy, creating a multi-generational cycle of trauma that continues to affect their descendants today. When Eichmann fled to Argentina after the war, he left his family behind in Germany. His wife Vera and the 4 boys lived in poverty, ostracized by their community, and struggling to survive on minimal resources. The children were told their father was dead, killed in the final days of the war while serving his country heroically. Klaus, the eldest, was 11 when his father disappeared. He retained some memories of Adolf Eichmann, but these were the ordinary memories of a child: his father reading bedtime stories, teaching him to ride a bicycle, helping with homework. Klaus had no understanding of his father's role in organizing mass murder, knowing him only as the man who would bring home chocolates and tell stories about his important work for the government. The family's circumstances in post-war Germany were desperate. Vera Eichmann was forced to work multiple jobs to support her 4 sons, while neighbors whispered about her husband's involvement with the Nazi Party. The boys faced constant bullying at school, where other children would taunt them about their father's disappearance and make jokes about Nazi war criminals. In 1952, when Klaus was 17, his mother revealed that his father was alive, and living in Argentina under a false name. The family was secretly reunited in Buenos Aires, where Adolf Eichmann was working in a factory and living as Ricardo Clement. The reunion was supposed to be a joyful occasion, but it became the beginning of the boys' psychological destruction. The psychological impact on the boys was devastating. They had spent years grieving their father's death, building memorial narratives about his heroic sacrifice, only to discover he was alive and had abandoned them. Worse, they began to learn the truth about his wartime activities through whispered conversations and newspaper clippings their father thought he had hidden. Klaus Eichmann later described the period between 1952 and 1960 as the most psychologically damaging of his life. He was living with a father he barely knew, in a country where he didn't speak the language, while slowly discovering that this man was responsible for organizing the transportation of millions of people to their deaths. The family dynamic in Argentina was deeply disturbed. Adolf Eichmann continued to live under his false identity, even within the family home, requiring his sons to call him Ricardo and maintain the fiction that they were Argentine immigrants. This constant role-playing created a surreal atmosphere where the boys were never sure which version of their father was real. During family meals, Eichmann would sometimes slip into discussions about his wartime work, describing the logistical challenges of moving large populations with the same tone he might use to discuss factory production schedules. He spoke about train timetables, deportation quotas, and transportation efficiency, as if these were ordinary business problems rather than the mechanics of genocide. The boys began to understand the true nature of their father's work through fragments of these conversations. Klaus described the horror of slowly realizing that when his father spoke about processing people and meeting delivery schedules, he was actually describing the systematic murder of families just like their own. The situation became even more traumatic when Israeli agents captured Adolf Eichmann in 1960. The international media attention was intense, and suddenly the Eichmann children found themselves at the center of a global news story. Photographers camped outside their home. Reporters attempted to interview them at school. Death threats arrived in the mail daily. During Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, Klaus made the psychologically devastating decision to attend some of the proceedings. He sat in the courtroom listening to testimony about his father's crimes, watching as survivor after survivor described the horror of the transportation systems his father had organized with bureaucratic precision. Klaus later described the experience as watching his father transform before his eyes from the man who had taught him to ride a bicycle into a monster whose crimes were almost incomprehensible in their scope and systematic cruelty. He watched his father take notes during testimony, seemingly more interested in correcting minor details about transportation schedules than in acknowledging the human suffering his work had caused. The trial revealed the full extent of Eichmann's role in the Holocaust, including his personal involvement in decisions about which trains would go to which camps, and his detailed knowledge of the death rates at various facilities. Klaus learned that his father had not been a reluctant functionary following orders, but an enthusiastic architect of genocide, who had taken pride in the efficiency of his systems. The other Eichmann sons faced their own psychological challenges. Horst developed what psychiatrists later diagnosed as complex PTSD, struggling with severe depression and anxiety that made it impossible for him to maintain employment or relationships. He became an alcoholic and spent years living on the streets, unable to cope with the knowledge of his father's crimes. Dieter moved to Europe and changed his name, but was eventually tracked down by journalists investigating the families of Nazi war criminals. The constant fear of discovery created severe paranoia and anxiety disorders. He described living in constant terror that someone would recognize him and exact revenge for his father's crimes. Ricardo, the youngest, developed severe anxiety disorders and required psychiatric treatment for decades. He struggled with what therapists identified as inherited guilt syndrome, feeling personally responsible for crimes committed before his birth. Ricardo described nightmares where he was aboard trains filled with deportees, trying to help them escape while his father's voice echoed through the cars, reading transportation schedules. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the multi-generational impact. When the Eichmann sons had children of their own, they faced the impossible decision of whether to tell them about their grandfather's identity. Those who chose honesty watched their own children struggle with inherited guilt and shame. Those who chose secrecy lived in constant fear of discovery. Klaus Eichmann's daughter, born in 1963, didn't learn about her grandfather's identity until she was 25 years old. The revelation sent her into a psychological crisis so severe that she required hospitalization. She later described feeling like her entire identity had been built on a lie and struggling with questions about whether evil could be inherited through bloodlines. The Eichmann family story represents one of the most extreme examples of how the crimes of Nazi leaders created ripple effects of trauma that extended far beyond their immediate victims, reaching into future generations and creating cycles of psychological damage that continue to this day. While the Eichmann children struggled with the bureaucratic machinery of genocide, another Nazi leader's son would face a different kind of psychological burden, one that involved decades of visiting his father in prison, while slowly coming to terms with the ideology that had destroyed their family. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy and one of his most loyal followers, had one son, Wolf Rüdiger Hess, born in 1937. Unlike the other cases we've examined, Wolf survived the war and lived to old age, but his survival came with a price that would haunt him for over 7 decades, creating one of the longest documented cases of inherited Nazi trauma in history. When his father made his mysterious flight to Scotland in 1941, attempting to negotiate peace with Britain, young Wolf was just 4 years old. He would spend the next 46 years visiting his father in Spandau prison, watching the man who had once been Hitler's most trusted deputy slowly deteriorate in solitary confinement, while maintaining his fanatical beliefs until his death. Wolf Rüdiger grew up in post-war Germany, carrying one of the most recognized names in Nazi history. Despite changing his surname multiple times and attempting to live a quiet life, he could never escape the shadow of his father's crimes. The name Hess was synonymous with Nazi fanaticism, and Wolf found that no amount of distance or time could erase the connection. The psychological burden began in childhood. Wolf's earliest memories involved being pointed at and whispered about by strangers who recognized his family name. At school, other children would taunt him with chants about his father's imprisonment and make jokes about Nazi war criminals. Teachers would often single him out for special attention, either treating him with suspicious hostility or uncomfortable sympathy. As Wolf grew older, the challenges became more complex. Employers would refuse to hire him once they discovered his identity. Some would express concern about the psychological stability of Rudolf Hess's son, questioning whether mental instability might be hereditary. Others worried about the public relations implications of employing someone with such a notorious family connection. The constant rejection and discrimination created severe psychological problems for Wolf. He developed what psychiatrists diagnosed as chronic anxiety disorder and severe depression. He described feeling like he was living in a constant state of guilt for crimes he never committed, yet somehow felt responsible for simply by being his father's son. The weekly prison visits to Spandau became the defining feature of Wolf's adult life. For 46 years, he would travel to Berlin to spend a few hours with his father, engaging in conversations that became increasingly surreal as Rudolf Hess descended into a mixture of genuine mental illness and performed insanity, designed to avoid taking responsibility for his crimes. During these visits, Rudolf Hess would alternate between lucid discussions of current events and rambling monologues about Nazi ideology. He would quiz Wolf about political developments, hoping to hear that National Socialism was experiencing a revival. When disappointed by Wolf's reports about Germany's democratic development, Rudolf would become agitated and launch into lengthy speeches about the betrayal of the German people by Jewish conspiracies. Wolf described these conversations as psychologically devastating. He loved his father as a son naturally would, but found himself listening to increasingly extreme expressions of the ideology that had led to genocide. Rudolf Hess never expressed remorse for his role in the Nazi regime, instead maintaining that he had been a patriot who was being unjustly persecuted by Germany's enemies. The situation became even more complex when Wolf's mother, Ilse Hess, proved to be equally problematic for the young man's psychological development. She remained a devoted Nazi until her death, constantly filling Wolf's childhood with propaganda about his father's innocence and the righteousness of the Nazi cause. This created a deeply conflicted internal struggle within Wolf, who simultaneously loved his parents while recognizing the horror of their beliefs. Ilse Hess established a network of Nazi sympathizers who would visit their home regularly, sharing stories about the good old days of the Third Reich and expressing their continued belief in Nazi ideology. Wolf grew up surrounded by unrepentant Nazis who treated his father as a hero and martyr, creating a distorted worldview that took years of therapy to correct. The psychological manipulation extended to Wolf's education. His mother homeschooled him for several years, using Nazi-approved textbooks and teaching him a version of history that portrayed Germany as the victim of an international conspiracy. When Wolf finally attended public school, he struggled to reconcile the history he had learned at home with the factual accounts of Nazi crimes presented in his classes. As Wolf reached adulthood, he began receiving letters from Holocaust survivors and families of victims. Some were filled with hatred and death threats, holding him responsible for his father's crimes. Others, surprisingly, contained messages of forgiveness and understanding, recognizing that he was also a victim of Nazi ideology. These letters created additional psychological turmoil for Wolf. The hate mail reinforced his feelings of inherited guilt, while the forgiveness letters made him feel undeserving of compassion. He described feeling trapped between competing emotions: love for his father, horror at his crimes, guilt for his family name, and gratitude for unexpected kindness from his father's victims. The burden became so overwhelming that Wolf seriously considered taking his own life on multiple occasions. He described standing on bridges and tall buildings, contemplating whether ending his life would finally free him from the curse of his family name. Only intensive psychiatric treatment and medication prevented him from acting on these impulses. Wolf's psychological problems were compounded by the media attention that surrounded his father's case. Rudolf Hess became a cause célèbre for neo-Nazi groups, who portrayed him as a political prisoner and martyr for the National Socialist cause. This meant that Wolf was constantly approached by extremist groups trying to recruit him to their movement, while simultaneously being monitored by authorities concerned about his potential for radicalization. The situation reached a critical and highly publicized crisis point in 1987 with the death of Rudolf Hess in Spandau prison, an event that triggered a wave of international controversy and ignited a storm of conspiracy theories. Hess, one of Adolf Hitler's closest confidants and the last surviving member of the Nazi leadership, still imprisoned at that time, died under circumstances that many deemed suspicious. Although official investigations concluded that he had committed suicide by hanging himself with an electrical cord, doubts persisted, especially among neo-Nazi factions and far-right sympathizers. These groups insisted that Hess had been deliberately murdered by Allied authorities to prevent him from revealing classified information or embarrassing wartime truths that might have come to light in his final years. His death was thus politicized and mythologized, turning the aging war criminal into a martyr figure for extremist ideologies. In the midst of this turbulent aftermath, Wolf Rudiger Hess, Rudolf Hess's only son, found himself thrust unwillingly into the global spotlight. Already burdened by the legacy of his father's infamy, he now had to navigate a complex and volatile situation in which neo-Nazi organizations looked to him as a symbolic leader and expected him to vocalize support for their revisionist agendas. At the same time, the international media scrutinized his every public appearance and statement, searching for any indication of latent Nazi sympathies or attempts to rehabilitate his father's image. Wolf found himself in a near-impossible position, vilified by many for being the son of a notorious war criminal, yet simultaneously idolized by extremist groups with whom he did not fully align. The psychological weight of this legacy was not limited to Wolf alone. It extended deeply into his family life and profoundly affected his children. His daughter, born in the 1960s, and raised during a time when Germany was still grappling with the moral wreckage of the Second World War, grew up acutely aware of her infamous lineage. She struggled with feelings of inherited guilt and internal conflict, grappling with questions of identity, shame, and moral responsibility that had tormented her father for decades. She later spoke publicly about the burden of carrying the Hess name, describing how she often avoided discussing her ancestry with peers, friends, and colleagues. Even in adulthood, she remained haunted by a legacy that was not her own doing, but which shaped the course of her life in deeply personal ways. The long shadow of Rudolf Hess's legacy did not stop with the second generation. It extended into the third. When Wolf's grandchildren began attending school, the multi-generational impact of inherited trauma became even more painfully evident. Despite the passage of time and their complete disconnection from the events of the Nazi era, the children were not spared from social stigma. Once their family name or lineage was discovered, they were often treated differently by classmates, teachers, and even parents of other children. Bullying and discrimination were common, and educators occasionally drew unwanted attention to them in class discussions on Nazi history, using them, intentionally or not, as living representations of historical atrocities. The children were thus denied the innocence and anonymity that should have been their birthright, burdened instead with the heavy weight of a grandfather they had never known, and whose crimes they did not commit. Wolf Rudolf Hess passed away in 2001, closing the chapter on a life spent under the persistent shadow of one of history's most reviled regimes. Throughout his lifetime, he had struggled to reconcile a son's loyalty with the public horror attached to his father's legacy. His personal and public identity were forever intertwined with the fate of a man who had helped shape the darkest period in modern history. His death marked the end of one of the longest and most well-documented cases of inherited Nazi trauma, a uniquely personal account of how the consequences of historical evil can ripple down through generations. Yet, even with his passing, the story did not truly end. His descendants continue to wrestle with questions of identity, guilt, and moral inheritance, carrying forward a legacy they neither chose nor endorsed. The hidden aftermath of World War II includes a haunting legacy: the psychological trauma passed down to the children of Nazi leaders. These descendants were not harmed by gas chambers or battlefields, but by the emotional wreckage left behind: guilt, shame, and the burden of inescapable family history. From the Goebbels children, killed by their parents in Hitler's bunker, to the Mengele family's years of deception, these stories reveal how Nazi ideology destroyed families from within. Many of these parents were so consumed by their beliefs that they chose to manipulate, abandon, or even kill their children, rather than let them grow up outside the Nazi worldview. The Himmler family offers a striking example. While one daughter publicly defended her father, other relatives lived under assumed identities for decades. Albert Speer's children endured constant reminders of their father's role in the regime, with his architectural legacy visible across post-war Germany. They struggled to reconcile their creative paths with the shadow of his collaboration. For the Eichmann sons, the psychological toll came from realizing their father helped organize genocide with chilling bureaucratic precision, an evil that didn't look like a monster, but like a man doing paperwork. Others, like Wolf Rudolf Hess, bore the lifelong burden of visiting their imprisoned fathers and carrying infamous names they never asked for. These stories have shaped our understanding of inherited trauma. Researchers and therapists have documented patterns of survivor guilt, identity confusion, chronic anxiety, and difficulty forming relationships. These findings have helped inform treatments for children of perpetrators and other atrocities, from genocide to terrorism. What makes these cases especially tragic is how unprepared post-war society was to help. Germany had no framework for supporting the children of war criminals. Many spent years in therapy trying to separate their love for their parents from horror at their crimes, and questioning whether evil could be passed down through blood. The trauma extended beyond the children themselves. Spouses who unknowingly married into these families, and friends who later discovered a loved one's dark heritage, also wrestled with deep emotional and ethical challenges. Educational institutions have since used these cases to study how extremist ideologies affect families over generations, helping to identify signs of radicalization and develop intervention strategies. The legal implications have been far-reaching as well, raising questions about whether descendants should benefit from wealth tied to war crimes or be held accountable in any way. Most importantly, these stories are a warning. The Nazi leaders who sacrificed their own children to their ideology show how belief systems can eclipse even the deepest human bonds. The children of these figures were, in a very real sense, casualties of war, trapped by legacies they did not choose, yet could never escape. And yet some have broken the silence. By speaking publicly, seeking therapy, or confronting their pasts, they offer a model for how inherited trauma can be addressed, and perhaps, over time, healed. Their courage reminds us that while evil may echo through generations, so can resilience, truth, and the hope of redemption. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.